On today's show, we are talking luxury tax. I'll do a deep dive into the Mets payroll and explain why they're in a position where they might as well buy because they're going to be expensive no matter what.
You are Locked On Mets, your daily New York Mets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello to all you amazing Mets fans. You're watching Locked On Mets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Ryan Finkelstein. If you want to find any of my work, follow me on X, Finkelstein Ryan. You can also find some of my writing at justbaseball.com, where I work as the managing editor. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 moneyline bet. It's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Now, how much money do the Mets have to spend this offseason? Obviously, with Steve Cohen, the resources are always limited, but there's also that thing called the luxury tax or the competitive balance tax, where teams are penalized for spending. And there was even a specific tax line created for Steve Cohen. He has been quoted in the past saying, if you're going to blow past the luxury tax, you might as well blow way past it. And that's what the Mets did this past season. But what I wanted to do is look at where they're at going into this year. Could the Mets consider taking a step back so that they can reset their luxury tax penalties or just not pay as much? Luckily, there is a fantastic article breaking down all of the payroll nuances, and it's written by Christopher Soto over at Metsmerize. Metsmerize is where I got my start. There is no better site for comprehensive written coverage on the New York Mets than Metsmerize. So I encourage all of you to check that out, and I will put a link to this article in the episode description. But Christopher Soto is like their tax guy. Okay, he is, I think he's an accountant. He just knows baseball numbers better than anyone and really dives deep into all this stuff. You can find him on Twitter at SotoC803. Let's just go through the numbers that he pulled here for the Mets payroll. So he broke it down in the article in different sections. The first one is simple guaranteed contracts. These are contracts where all you have to do to figure out the luxury tax is look at the average annual value. That's Brandon Nimmo, that's Starling Marte, that's Kodai Senga, that's Jose Quintana, and that's Jeff McNeil. That total salary is $80.25 million for all those players. Okay, so that's your beginning baseline. Then you have the guaranteed contracts from option years. So that's Brooks Raley and Elmore Narvaez. Was Adam Ottavino, but he decided not to exercise his player option. So between the two of those guys, Raley and Narvaez, you're looking at $12.75 million added on. So for those counted at home, you're at $93 million right there. Then you look at guaranteed contracts with deferrals. Okay. So this is a complicated part of the luxury tax that, Christopher explains in his article. Essentially, this is factoring in deferred money. So for Lindor, there's $50 million deferred in his $341 million contract. For Edwin Diaz, there's $26.5 million deferred. Now, they did that for a couple of things. In some respects, it helped the Mets in the short term, but really it helped them with the luxury tax. It took their luxury tax numbers down. So all you have to worry about, if you want to understand how that math is figured out, you can find it in the article. But for our purposes, that takes Lindor's average annual value down to $32.35 million, as is calculated in the luxury tax, and Edwin Diaz to $17.38 million. Now, I'm going to pull out my phone here because I'm not going to keep on remembering all that math. We started with the 80.25. Let's add that in there. We throw in the 12.75. That got us to the 93 million. Now we're going to tack on $49.73 million. Now, all this is calculated at the end of his article, but I want to be able to keep tabs on it as we go through, because this is where we get to the really fun section. Dead money. Justin Verlander, Max Scherzer, James McCann, and there's a little bit on there for Adam Ottavino, which he explains it more. It's less than $1 million how much that factors in. And he explains why. But Looking at all that dead money, Christopher accounts it as $63.25 million in dead money. Now, I was confused by this a little bit because I have looked at, Spot Track and have seen the money that Scherzer's getting paid by the Rangers and Justin Verlander by the Astros, and both of them were at about $22.5 million. The Mets were paying a little over $20 million this year. So I thought, okay, how is he calculating their AAV for luxury tax at $26.36 million? And also, if you go to Spot Track, they don't have it at that number. They have it at the 20.8 range. So there could be some variance if Christopher is wrong here, but what he is saying, and I trust that he spends way more time on this than I do, and he's right. He says for MLB luxury tax purposes, the prorated amount of remaining salaries on both contracts are used to determine the cash impact split between 2023 and 2024. So that's taking the money the Mets sent to the Rangers on Scherzer, $35.5 million, and on Verlander to the Astros, $35 million. And then it's prorated based on, I guess, the amount of time spent. So if a quarter of the time spent with those teams was the end of last season, that's where they get to the percentage for each of these guys that the Mets had to pay. So for Scherzer, that means that 74.7% of the cash sent out, so 74.7% of the $35.5 million that was sent out is going to go on the Mets luxury tax this year. And for Verlander, 75.3%. That's how you get to the 26.36 million and the 26.53 million. Bottom line through all of this, total dead money, that is 63.25 million, which brings the Mets all the way up to $205.98 million before you even get to arbitration contracts. We've talked about that in the show previously. Pete Alonso, big chunk of it. If you just factor in Alonso, who's making over $20 million in arbitration for sure, David Peterson, Joey Lucchesi, guys that I can't see them non-tendering. Two relievers, Drew Smith, Trevor Gott maybe, but they just keep two of those types of guys. If they keep Louis Guillorme, you're easily going to get to at least $30 million. Yes, maybe they can shave 8 of it off if they want to by non-tendering guys, but you're at least adding $30 million in arbitration. So that gives us 23, we'll just round it up to $236 million. Then you have the renewable contracts. That's pre-arbitration guys like Francisco Alvarez, Brett Beatty, Mark Vientos, all those different players who have yet to hit arbitration. Christopher calculates them at $5.9 million. So you throw that on there. You're already sitting over $240 million comfortably. Then there's another part of the luxury tax requirements that Christopher mentions, and that is the player benefits pool and the pre-arbitration bonus pools, which were part of the CBA. That adds on an additional $19.57 million. And when you round it all together, the Mets are sitting at $269.55 million. And that's, I think, accounting for all the arbitration guys getting picked up. Maybe you can lop off some of it. If you want to say it's 260, fine. But the competitive balance tax, the first threshold is 237 million. So they've blown past that one. And as we'll get to in the next segment, they're pretty much sitting in a position where if they just marginally add to the team this offseason, they're going to be getting pretty close to the highest repeater tax line, the Steve Cohen tax line, all of it. And because they're just this far in the hole, it kind of puts you in a position where you might as well spend. I'll explain where they're at a little bit more when it comes to those lines and what it means when it comes to penalties next. Before we get into that, though, today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Score early this NFL season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. So this weekend, you feel really confident about your team, or maybe you just want to look at the best team in the NFL that has the most overwhelming matchup. Put a little $5 money line bet on that, and you can get $150 in bonus bets. Not to mention, this is really the perfect time to join FanDuel because there's so much action going on. You have college football, you got the NFL, and you got the basketball season in full swing. The in-season tournament, if you care about that, All of it is available for you at FanDuel, and there's so many options between betting on the spread, player props, over-unders, and more. Giving combined bets in a parlay. A lot that you can find at FanDuel.com. So head there at FanDuel.com/lockedon to kick off the NFL season. Remember, $5 winning money line bet, and you get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. Visit FanDuel, the official partner of the NFL. Picking up from the last segment as we talk math here on Locked On Mets, their payroll, according to Christopher Soto in this article for Metsmerize, it is sitting at $269.55 million, assuming all those arbitration guys kick in. Now, the Mets could shave some money off that. Daniel Vogelback, I think it's like $2.6 million is his projected arbitration salary. You could probably get that one off the books. There's a couple more. But again, you're not going to shave much more than $10 million. And probably it's even less than that. It might be closer to 5, maybe 6. Bottom line, you're going to be north of $260 million. Okay, that's going into the offseason. Now, in the article from Metsmerize, Christopher says they're already sitting in the second level of tax penalties with $2.7 million of space before they get to the third level. Now, I think it's actually a little more room. Again, I do trust his judgment. He's probably right. But if you look at MLB.com's explanation of the luxury tax penalties, it says there's a surcharge that I believe is the third line that he's talking about. That's $40 million from the tax line. The tax line's at 237. Maybe it's $277 million that would get to the third line of penalties. And then if you exceed $60 million, which would be at $297 million, that's the Steve Cohen line. So let's just say, for sake of argument, you have, I don't know, right now, 10. We'll just call it $10 million to play with before you get to the third level. Is it worth it for the Mets to send Alonso's $20 million out and then use that $20 million in the 10 of room, that's $30 million, to rebuild your team to kind of be competitive this year? Like, what does that look like? Well, if you have to replace Alonso at first base, unless you're just so hell-bent on the kids and you think Mark Vientos can do it, if you sign a first baseman, that's going to run you at least 10. So how much money did you save, really? Because then you still have to get your starters, your relievers. There's just not, unless they find some crazy team that wants to absorb Starling Marte's salary or Omar Narvaez's salary, guys that are coming off down years, or unless you're trading like Brandon Nimmo, which would be silly to do because he seems to be a guy that's on a pretty good contract for you and can be a big part of your team moving forward. There's just not a world where the Mets aren't a luxury tax team. We'll start there. So they're going to be in the repeater tax no matter what. Now, what level of tax they go to, yeah, they can probably stay away from that Steve Cohen line if they really wanted to. But how are you going to win this year? And if you're not planning to win this year, that's a lot of money that Steve Cohen's going to spend to just sit on his hands for a season. It just does not compute. So, yes, there was a lot of talk at the deadline, with Max Scherzer's comments. The Mets aren't intended to compete next year. Well, that's what they told him to get him to waive his no-trade clause. That was where the conversation was at with Justin Verlander. Now, they're sitting with all their dead money on the books that really precludes them from actually taking a year for development. That's the thing. If Christopher's calculations are correct and there's $60+ million of dead money on the books, a lot of it coming from those two guys. If that wasn't there, yeah, you could actually say, this is the reset year. And it would make sense to reset this year. Because again, that is something. If a club, this is from MLB.com, if a club dips below the luxury tax threshold for a season, the penalty level resets. So a club that exceeds the threshold for 2 straight seasons, but then dips below it, would be back to the 20% penalty. The bottom line is every single year you're over, it gets worse and worse and worse for you. So there is a benefit to get under that threshold. There is. And again, the timeline of this Mets team with the young players coming up, if they were far removed from it, if they had a chance, if they could trade one player and get under that line, well, yeah, maybe it would make sense. Let's just keep this team as cheap as we can with our upgrades, try to find talent within the margins, roll with the roster that you have, give a lot of playing time to the young players in 2025. All that money comes off the books and you're in a better place. But again, they're so in the hole that they can't do that. They're going to be a tax-paying team. And so Steve Cohen can either continue to spend for this one season, or he can be a Steve Cohen tax-paying team with a roster that just doesn't have the pieces needed to win. And with that, it actually makes the choice really simple for this front office and for Steve Cohen. And it's keep on going for it. Now, what does that look like? And what type of contract should they be going after with the context of potentially resetting at some point below that luxury tax line? If that is something that they care to do, because, hey, it's Steve Cohen, they don't have to. But if we're just thinking that at some point with young talent coming up, they want a sustained winner that doesn't have to have a bloated $300 million payroll to contend each year. How do they get there? What type of contract should they sign? That's what we'll discuss next. First, though, another word from our sponsors. Now, before I get into how I believe the Mets should spend this offseason, considering where they're at with the luxury tax, I want to address a couple news items before I forget. For one, Kodai Senga was the runner-up in the Rookie of the Year. Corbin Carroll, to no one's surprise, won the award. The other big note, Carlos Mendoza has officially been announced as the Mets manager, and they will have an introductory press conference at noon on Tuesday. If you want to get my live reaction to everything going on in the Mendoza press conference, you can become a Locked On Mets insider today. This is a texting service where you can get the updates that I sent to all the Locked On Mets insiders, and you can comment back to me. You can send me texts, ask me any questions you want, any comments on the show, on the press conference, whatever it is, and we can have a nice open line of communication. So if you want to be part of the live experience today during the press conference, find the link in the episode description or go to subtext.com/LockedOnMets. All right, so again, this is not an offseason to scale back the spending. That could come next year. Okay, in 2025, you'll have Scherzer come off the books, James McCann come off the books. Justin Verlander, there's still a club option that the Mets, have agreed to spend $17.5 million on, so he might still be there as dead money. But Pete Alonso, technically off the books, although you'd think they'll try to extend him or re-sign him if he hits free agency. You'll have Quintana off the books, Narvaez off the books, Rayleigh off the books. Right now, if you go to Spot Track, they have the Mets payroll when it comes to the tax next year at 2025 set $146 million. Now, this isn't as thorough as the type of accounting that Christopher Soto did on this year's payroll. It could be more than that, could be less than that, but this is just a general overview of where the Mets are. That would give them $95 million under the luxury tax to spend. 2026, they're sitting at a little over, it's about $110 million. So we'll just round it off for the tax line. That'd be at $244 million. So well over $100 million in spending room. The Mets could get to a point where they actually could fall below the luxury tax line in one of those 2 years if they chose to. So those would be the years where you want to be a little more careful about the money you add to your books. Here's an example. Starling Marte, when they signed to that 4-year deal, was it 4 years, $72 million? That's a contract that I don't think the Mets should sign this time around. I think there's two types of deals the Mets should be looking at. They should be looking at a player that's a part of their core. And by a part of their core, I'm talking the Brandon Nimmo, Francisco Lindor, that long core. Okay, if there's a player that fits a long window that you can sign, those are players that it really doesn't matter the cost. Pay market value, land those guys. And those type of players are particularly the starting pitchers in this market. So Yoshinobu Yamamoto, the clear number one free agent target. If they struck out at him, they wanted to get in the bidding on Aaron Nola or Blake Snell. Those guys would fit that criteria. Jordan Montgomery, another one, doesn't have a qualifying offer attached to him, so no draft pick compensation will have to be given up there. I like him a lot. And I don't know how many years he'll get. Maybe he doesn't get as many, but he's a guy that if you're thinking about the next 4 to 5 years, he fits your window. You're okay spending there. Eduardo Rodriguez, kind of a similar type of free agent in this class. And then Shohei Ohtani, of course, is a whole other conversation for a different day. But he'd also fall into the line of guys that could be a key part of your future that it'd be okay to spend on now. But the guys that I'm looking at here that I don't think make sense to spend on a longer term deal that are going to get multi-year contracts, it's guys like Matt Chapman, Cody Bellinger, Teoscar Hernandez, Lourdes Gurriel. These are free agents that in this class are going to get significantly overpaid because there's just not a lot of value to be found when it comes to position players. There's a lot of teams trying to compete. So if those teams who are trying to compete for the services of a guy like Bellinger, because he's the best outfielder available, or Matt Chapman, who's the best infielder available, they're going to get bloated contracts that might hurt you in 2025, 2026, 2027. And it isn't necessarily the piece that's going to put you over the top to win now. The Mets aren't in that zone. Jock Peterson's another one where I think he might get a 3-year deal. Maybe the last time he can get a contract like that. And then they should stay away from stuff like that. If I'm David Stearns, I'm looking again at pieces that fit really long term, or I'm looking at super short term. So I'm comfortable overpaying on a 1-year deal because it doesn't hamstring me at all in 2025, 2026, 2027, when I have a better idea on what the affordable part of my core is. When I know which prospect came up. I know that Drew Gilbert's a stud on a pre-arbitration deal for a couple more years before he even starts getting paid. Or maybe you sign to a pre-arb contract and you have a fixed number that's low. Once you get more clarity, you're going to be able to spend better for the 2025 or 2026 Mets when you have another year of information at your disposal. So I'd really be focused. If it's not Yamamoto almost, like to me, it's like, all right, well, then just spend on short-term guys. Obviously, they have to add a starting pitcher, and that's where I put more candidates there. But when it comes to spending big this offseason, it's outbidding the pack on a Justin Turner or Brandon Belt or a JD Martinez or Adam Duvall, Kevin Kiermaier. These guys that are at the latter stage of their career who still proved last year that they can be, real assets to a winning team. Tommy Pham sort of fits under that same bill. Those are the guys that I say, all right, if you got to spend a couple extra $1 million, at least it's on a 1-year deal. And you can get a big bat to put into your lineup at that DH spot in particular. And it doesn't matter that they might be expensive because your team's expensive. Now, of those guys listed, I've spent a lot of shows on them previously, but I would say the two that intrigue me the most for this core is Justin Turner and Adam Duvall, because I think they both add another home run threat, an RBI threat in your lineup, but they also add a guy that doesn't have to be a DH. I think both of them could DH a little bit. Duvall probably less so because you'd want to stick him in the outfield. He's really good in the corners, but he's also a guy that has an injury history. So, you never know. Maybe you would be sort of alternating him and Starling Marte as DHs to try to keep them on their feet. With Justin Turner, if you were to sign him, he could be your DH if Brett Beatty or Ryan Maurice shows you're starting third baseman. But if those guys can't grab the position, if they're struggling, well, Justin Turner, I still think could play a pretty solid third base, and it would make a lot of sense for your roster. So, again, those are the type of guys where you can spend big on because short term and particularly 1-year deals. Now, starting pitchers, there's not a lot that fit that billing. Impact guys on 1-year deals to overpay for, so to speak. I would say if Seth Lugo or Michael Wacha is not going to get a multi-year deal, those would be guys to seriously consider. Lucas Giolito, I've talked about before. He might be looking for a 1-year deal to reset his market. So maybe you are the highest bidder there. It might not be in a crazy amount, but you make sure you get him because he could have some upside and he wouldn't hamstring you long term. Frankie Montas, another guy that needs to reset his value off a lost season due to injury. And maybe you spend a little bit more than the other teams that are, willing to gamble on him because you just want to say, all right, he has a capability to improve the ceiling of our roster, and that's what we're looking for. I really think that is how the Mets should be viewing this offseason, and I sort of imagine that's going to be the strategy here. They're going to spend. I really believe that. And part of it could also be spending in the bullpen because a lot of relievers can be had on 1-year deals. So especially the older guys like Hector Neris, David Robertson, Aroldis Chapman, Craig Kimbrell, Joe Kelly. They all sort of fit that. And if you do have to sign a reliever to a multi-year deal, two guys that jump out to me since I was just looking through the class, Ronaldo Lopez and Jordan Hicks. Maybe we'll do an episode coming up here at some point about how the Mets can maybe rebuild a bullpen. It's always so tough to figure that out, but I could throw some names out there that make a lot of sense. Those two are guys that are still relatively young. Hicks is 27, Lopez is 30. I'd be okay if they gave those guys a multi-year deal because it's a reliever salary that probably isn't going to kill you when it comes to how you're planning on spending in the coming years. Anyway, though, that's where I think the Mets are at. It's still Yamamoto or bust for me when it comes to this free agent class, but the Mets are creative. They can find a way to really improve their roster for this upcoming season while keeping the flexibility necessary to really be reimagined and be a team with hopefully a burgeoning young core that looks different in 2025, 2026, and beyond. Anyway, that's going to be all again for today's show. We got the Mendoza press conference. That'll be tomorrow's show. Again, if you want to get my text updates throughout the presser, you can do so at subtext, be a Locked On Mets Insider. You can find the link in the episode description. And if you want to make sure you don't miss tomorrow's show, follow, rate, review, wherever you get your podcast, hit subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, we're trying to get to 10,000 subs. So appreciate all of you. Hit that subscribe. Follow me on X at Finkelstein Ryan. Follow the show, Locked On Mets.